Now having rendered the stateful component, one of the things that is different from the functional component is the stateful component can hold state. Now state is nothing but the data that is associated with the component. Okay, a functional component does not have state. A functional component can only receive data as part of the parameters in the prop. A stateful component can both receive a props as parameter as well as it can hold the state as well. Okay. Now the constructor is the only place where you can initialize the state. In rest of the other code, whenever the state changes, you should never mutate the state or change the state directly. You have to call a method called as setState. Now let us get into detail of how setState is implemented. Okay, and in this version of our tiny React, we will be kind of implementing a synchronous version of setState. And before I do that, let me create a button in here so that maybe we have something to click on, and later I'll change it out. So we already have this button component, right? So I'm not sure whether this button component will be rendered at this point in time, but let's save this and go back to the browser and do a refresh just to ensure that everything is working or not. So we have the button coming up, right? So I'll just click on this button and the alert is coming as well. Now what I need to do is, I want that whenever I click on this button, some state should change. Okay, right now we don't have any state in the application, so let's come back in the constructor and initialize a state. So I'll create a property called as title, and I'll put it as some default name, right? Say default title. So once I initialize the state in here, now the thing is, the state can contain any information. It can be an array, it can be an array of objects, it could be anything. So now instead of hard coding the title here, I'll grab this information from this dot state dot title. Okay, so at this point in time, this state will serve as a local instance object to this alert class, and the output should be rendered out correctly. Okay, and I'll do a couple of more changes in here. I'll simply remove this hard component from here, and I'll write the text as change title. Okay, now once I save this and go back to the browser and do a refresh, I'll see the default title being rendered from the instance variable, that is state. Okay, and also there is a change title button. Now what I want to do is, when I click on this change title, I want the state to change. Okay, and what happens in React is the behavior, whenever the state changes, the render method is automatically called so that the new virtual DOM is created again. Okay, and we want the new title to be displayed in this header. Okay, that's what we need to do. When I click on this button, I need to call a method that will change the state, and the moment the state change happens, the render method will be called automatically and the new user interface will be rendered. So now the invocation of the setState method in the button click will look like this. So right within this click handler, we could also extract this click handler outside the render method, but I'll keep it here for now. And here I'll call a method called this dot setState. Okay, and then pass in the attribute that will be changing, right? So in this case, we need to change the title. So I'll give the property name as title, and the new value I will say new date. Okay, I'm just creating the random date in here dot toString. So what I mean by this is, whenever this button click happens, the state value should change and the title should be whatever the new date time is at that point in time. Now at this point in time, we haven't yet implemented the setState method in the base component. Okay, so let's go back to the dom.js file and implement the setState method. Okay, let's for a moment just save this file and go back to the browser and do a refresh. And let's click on this button. So you get the error message that this dot setState is not a function. Okay, so let's go back to our dom.js now and then start writing this function in here. So right within this constructor, first I'll initialize the state. Okay, I'll set the default state to an empty string. Also create a previous state variable. This will be used later on when we will be adding the lifecycle methods for this component. And next thing that we need to do is to implement the setState method, right? So I'll come back in here and create a new method called setState that takes in the next state. Okay, and what we will do here is we'll check for the previous state if this dot previous state is there or not. If it is not there, we will set the previous state to whatever is in the this dot state, and then we will assign the state back. So as a rule, we should never mutate the state. We should never say this dot state equal to next state. Okay, Okay, this is state mutating, which is bad from a React perspective, as it's very difficult to track which object have changed, something like that, right? So rather than doing this, we have to clone this, or maybe rather an easy way, we can use object.assign method, which is a new JavaScript feature, and create an empty literal wherein all the properties will be copied from this .state as well as next. Okay, so this should set out the update the state back to the latest value. That now at this point in time, what will happen is if we try to execute this code, right, the state will be correctly updated, but the render will not happen, right? So this is the place we have to kind of invoke the render method. Now before we invoke the render method, there are a couple of things that we need to do. The first change that we will make is let's take a peek at the stateful component rendering, right? So we have this method here called build stateful component. Now here we did made a note that with every virtual element we are also storing the component reference, right? So now what we need to do is with every component we also need to keep the actual DOM element that component is tied to. Okay, so now let's go back to the mount simple node method in here. So here we have this mount simple node method, and just kind of before this for loop, okay, I'll do a very simple check in here. I'll come back in here. We already have this variable created, right, somewhere. Let me take a very close look at this, just above this child loops in here. Okay, so let's grab the component from the vdom.component. Okay, so at this point in time, I don't know whether this component is there or not, right? Because this could be a DOM element, or this vdom could be a component as well. Okay, now if there is a component reference, then we will invoke a method called component.setDOM element, which we have to write, right? We haven't yet written this method, and pass in the new DOM element. So this is where the DOM element, the actual DOM element that is created, is connected to the component. Okay, reference is kind of stored. Now once I do this, I'll come back to my component class and implement this setDOM element method. Okay, it's a very simple method. I'll simply come back in here and write this method. Okay, this simply stores this DOM into an instance variable called _DOM. But similarly, we need to have a get DOM element method as well, which will return this object back. So now we have a way to set the DOM element with the component as well as retrieve the DOM element. Now once we implement these two methods, we can go back to the setState implementation. Now in the setState, once we set this state in here, we'll grab the DOM element, okay, by calling this .get DOM element. Okay, so once we get the DOM element, we will get the container as well. Okay, the parent element, which is nothing but DOM.parent node. Okay, now we have both the things, right? So let's create the new virtual DOM. Now new virtual DOM can be created by invoking the render method. Now if you take a look at this code, there is no render method in this component, right? This is because at runtime, whatever context this component has, right? So in this case, when this code is executed, the instance will point to alert. So in here, when you say this object will point to the alert object, and the render method of the alert object will be called. Okay, this is how the inheritance kind of work. Okay, so in here we are creating the new DOM. Now as a rule, whenever the new virtual DOM is created, we have to recursively diff again, right? So that the entire child elements can be diffed as well. Okay, so we'll invoke the diff method, okay, pass in the new vdom, okay, as well as the container and the old DOM. So once I do this, I'll save this and go back to the browser and do a refresh. Okay, now if I click on this change title, okay, I'll remove this breakpoint, okay, and execute the code. You see the title is getting changed, right? And the UI is also correctly rendered as well. Okay, so what happened was when you clicked on the change title, okay, the event handler fired and the setState method was called. The setState method grabbed the DOM element of the old component, invoked the render method, and called the diff again. So let's kind of debug this and understand this process as well. So to understand how this works, I'll reload the screen again and then go back to my dom.js file and put a breakpoint in the setState method. Now when you click on the buttons change title, okay, the setState method will be invoked, right? So we can kind of troubleshoot the value. Now at this point in time, I'll put a breakpoint in here and click on change title. You can see the new state wherein the current date is being passed to the setState as a parameter, right? Now if I debug further, you can see that a new object is assigned and the state is kind of updated. And now once the state is updated, I am grabbing the DOM element which is the div with an alert container, right? That's the right one. And getting the parent node, which is the div with a root, right? And then we are calling the render again. The moment you call this render, right? So I'll come back to this application here and put a breakpoint in the render here. Okay, the alerts render. Okay, now if I press F11, okay, see, I am actually back to the render method in the alert class. Okay, now at this point in time, if you hover the mouse in the state object, you will see for some reason this is not available. This is kind of a Chrome debugger issue. Okay, but this new value is kind of available in here. So if I go back in here and then execute this entire thing, so the new virtual DOM is created, and then again the diff method is called with the new virtual DOM, the container and the DOM. Okay, I could press F11 again, it will come back to this diff method again, and this VDOM is now pointing to the new VDOM that is created, right? And the diff will continue. Okay, you can debug and understand more. Okay, now at this point in time, I'll simply execute this code in here, and you can see the new title being rendered. I could click in again. I'll remove this breakpoint from in here, and you can see the values getting changed in here, right? Okay, one more thing you will observe is, if I go back to the element and expand the root, okay, now observe here, right? So we have h2, we have div, we have button, right? Now when I click on this change title, this h2 will change. Okay, and the div will change because that's a parent container, right? The button is changing because that's a functional component. Okay, but then are you sure this text content is not changing? Okay, maybe in later episode we will see how to optimize this button as well. Now before we move with the next topic, let's also very quickly take a look at some of the better practices that you can put in this code. Now at this point in time, your alert component has a button that has an on-click event handler, right? Now this is an inline arrow function that we are using in here. Now kind of this is not very recommended from performance perspective, because every time this render component is invoked, a new version of this anonymous functions will be created, right? So that can leak some memory in certain situations. Okay, so a better thing would be to extract this into a function. Maybe I'll come outside in here and write a method called as, say, maybe change title. Okay, and then I could take this entire code, okay, and then simply invoke this dot change title from here, and put the setState method in here. So this is kind of a better practice. Now this will not work, right? So let us understand why this will not work first, or this may work also, I'm not sure, but let's take a very quick look at this. Okay, again we have an arrow function in here, right? So I can get rid of this arrow function as well. Okay, and now we only have a reference to the this dot change title method. Now if I save this and go back to my browser and do a refresh, okay, now if I click on this change title, you will get an error here, right? So if I open up the console, the error is this dot setState is not a function, right? Now that this is kind of strange, right? So let's understand this error. I'll go back to the source code and put a breakpoint on the change title method. And now I'll click on this change title again. Okay, now if I move the mouse over this, so this, now observe this, right? This is pointing to button and not the instance of this alert. Now, ideally this should have pointed to this alert class, right? So this is a very tricky situation with JavaScript. This keeps on changing, right? Now what we need to do is to bound this to the instance of this alert class in here, right? That's where things will get fixed. Okay, so to do that, come back to this constructor code in here, and in here we could say this dot change title is equal to this dot change title dot bind this. So here we are binding the context to the instance of alert, so that this will point to the alert class and not the button object on which the click happened, right? At this point in time, if you save this and go back to the browser and do a refresh, okay, and then click on this change title, you will see the value coming out correctly, right? So this is one of the better practices that you can adopt in your code.